Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, today we're talking about the history and, well, almost the spiritual condition of Australia, that vast land we still tend to squeeze into a few garish caricatures. I'm joined by the award-winning novelist Kate Grenville, who's fictionalised some of the early stories of white settlers and Aboriginal people moving from curiosity and wonder to cruelty and greed. By the opera singer Deborah Cheetham, herself Aboriginal, but who also describes herself as a closet white Baptist lesbian ABBA fan, and has written Australia's first Indigenous opera, of which more later. But we're going to start today with the writer Thomas Keneally, perhaps best known for novels such as Schindler's List and The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, but who has since turned historian, recently producing a multi-volume history of Australia. And the latest one takes us up from the 1860s and the end of the transportation of convicts right up to just after the First World War. This is, I guess, the period when Australia is really becoming a nation, moving from being individual colonies coming together in a new way.
Yes, population is increasing. The convicts are still with us, including some relatives of mine. These colonies, which after all are round about as widespread as London to Moscow, are considering struggling to confederate over such a huge distance without email and without telephone. It's astounding that they managed to do so. And the question arose, is Australia the working man's paradise? And is the Australian land the ennobler of the immigrant from Europe?
And certainly at the beginning of this period, in what we might think of in Britain as mid-Victorian times, it's still unclear really what's in the middle of Australia as far as the white settlers are concerned. There are no rivers, but this becomes only slowly apparent. As you say, there's no Mississippi in this country. And it's going to be an arid and tough place to settle.
And that's contrary to what British novelists like Trollope and Dickens believed about Australia. Dickens sent two of his boys here, his sons, on the basis that if Magwitch in Great Expectations, the convict revenant to England, could succeed here, then both his sons could. And they ran up against the reality of rainfall and its infrequency and the agony it produces for any European who first drives out the Aboriginals and then brings what you could call the dreaming of sheep and cattle to these marginal areas.
And quite bizarrely, they also rub up against Trollope's son, who's there as well.
Yes. Well, you see, that's the thing about transportation. It didn't end with convicts. Britain has always used Australia as a dumping ground for the socially unedifying. Recently, your Prime Minister before last, Mr. Brown, apologised to all the poor children that were sent here as a part of various improving schemes. Many of them, a friend of mine, were told that they were orphans, and they were not, and they were put in terrible homes, and therefore transportation continued, if you like, till the 20th century.
Meanwhile, the image of Australia all the way through is of this incredibly healthy country where none of the slum conditions that workers in Europe experienced took place, where there were these clean-limbed, healthy, bronzed, sort of happy workers. And as your book reveals, this is far from the truth.
Far from the truth, but what was interesting in Australia is that people expected it to be more utopian. They'd made this huge, irreversible, in most cases, journey, and they expected Australia to be the working man's paradise. And when it wasn't, they always believed, and they believe to this day, Australians, that if they can just tune the political system a little bit, or the industrial system, it will deliver them that utopian result. So that is an ongoing expectation, even with the dismal political parties we have, even globalised, we're still expectant of utopia.
And in this odd utopia or dystopia or whatever it might be, certainly in the period that you're describing, as the country's struggling to come together, so there's vast areas of it which are basically lawless. And you take us through the whole Bushranger period and the different gangs. Ned Kelly, is a kind of extraordinarily iconic figure almost immediately, despite all the killings.
Yes, Ned Kelly is the most famous of bushrangers, and these were men who, or even after the telegraph and the building of the railroads, were able to hold up entire towns, take entire towns hostages. They had the best horses, they knew the country they were dealing with, and part of their mystique is that when they robbed banks, they burnt the mortgages contained in the safe. As notable an Australian as Geoffrey Robinson said to me, Ned Kelly was a jihadist. And I said, no, he wasn't. He tried not to wreck that train coming out of Melbourne. And he said, you're only saying that because your grandparents were Irish. Yeah. But no, he was more than a jihadist. It's interesting how some bushrangers have retained an affection in Australian popular history and others have not. The ones who were true criminals have not.
He also had the best words. I mean, there's a wonderful quote in your book, the famous letter he wrote explaining his actions, where he describes the authorities as a parcel of big, ugly, fat-necked, wombat-headed, big-bellied, magpie-legged, narrow-hipped, splay-footed sons of Irish bailiffs or English landlords, which is better known as officers of justice. I mean, he had clearly the gift of the gab, beautiful sort of sense of language there.
And even there, you see, he's complaining about the fact that the old world, the conditions of the old world, are repeated here. Yeah. And many immigrants came here, and many young Australians grew up with the expectation that the old world would not prevail in the new world.
Let me ask just about your approach to history, both in this and the earlier volume. You tell history very much through the stories of individuals. You most of them relatively well known, quite a few of them not well known at all.
That's right. That's why the Dickens boys were great. Through the Dickens boys, you can see the reality of dry Australia. You can see that dreaming of cattle I mentioned earlier. You can see the genuine hardship of frontier life, and you can see what happens when a German stock rider with asthma rides out with an ore book in his saddlebag and discovers ore at a place called Broken Hill, and suddenly there are mines, and suddenly there are unions. You know, the most troublesome unionists from Britain always came to Australia, and suddenly there is a new industrial landscape in the wilderness. And so my method is simply to take someone most intelligent readers have not heard of or don't expect to be there, and to look at entire contours of the social history through them.
There's such a lot we could talk about, but I must also just mention that the very first surf culture comes pretty early 1900s, 1907.
It balanced the idea that the land was all that ennobled people and that the city degraded people. But suddenly, young men and women were beginning to surf, and they were not using bathing machines, and it was complained that the young men from the slums wore woolen pants to bathe, in which were delineated by wet water, things that should not be seen by respectable women.
There's some hilarious, complaints about it.
And from a standing start, the surf became the other icon of Australian identity. The surf, the surfboat, the reel march, the heroic swimmer, basically the bronze Australian, whom I'm sad to say I do not represent.
We're going to come and talk much more directly about Aboriginal history in a moment, but I was wondering, first of all, Deborah, about the way that Aboriginal history is portrayed, because there's the documents, there's the narratives, there's the all the paperwork which allows settler history to be told, but there's this whole other history which somebody like Thomas can only approach really when there is a moment of conflict. We don't have any idea really of what was going on across the rest of the continent while the settlers were moving in from the edges.
Well, first may I say that it's refreshing to have Aboriginal history retold through the eyes of individuals, through the eyes of what must only have been such an alarming time for my ancestors at first contact, which of course in Western Australia was much later than anywhere else. But here in the southeastern part of Australia, first contact was very, very early on. And culture, which was always, as you say, it wasn't written down, but it was passed on through all of the various arts, with first contact coming so early here in the southeastern part of Australia. Much of it had to be hidden away and can only really be prized from people, even my own relations, very carefully handing over pieces of information, just even in this last decade. But it's very refreshing to read Aboriginal history, something that's been denied non-Aboriginal Australia and Aboriginal Australia for all these many 230 so years.
Kate, in your trilogy about the colonisation of Australia, you start, of course, with the first contact, or even just before the first contact. And just staying with the problem of telling the Aboriginal story, I think there was something like, it's thought 200 languages, Aboriginal languages in Australia before the European arrival. It's a very moving part in your first novel, where your hero, who's a sort of man of the Enlightenment, who will later go on to take on the slave trade, starts to create a dictionary of the local language and English. Almost all of that native language has now been lost, hasn't it?
I think there are still a good few.
There are a few.
But there were more. There were many more.
Yes. Well, in living history, in living memory rather, you have grandmothers now who, you know, when they were young, when they were first having their children, they would never have dared pass on language to those children because, of course, the Aboriginal children who spoke in language were the first to be taken. So there's a lot of language there that is yet to be untapped and is in danger, of course, of dying out with people as they become more frail. And there is this reluctance at times to share the language, but there's much more being spoken than you would actually realise. And I love that comparison of Moscow to London being the sweep of Australian geography, of course, and those 200 languages. Well, if you think of Europe and how many cultures and languages, I often equate Aboriginal Australia to Europe.
And it's very interesting. Everywhere in Australia, I come across the phrase that the Aboriginal culture is the longest constantly surviving human culture. And I just wonder what the effect has been of all the recent mitochondrial DNA research, which shows pretty conclusively that the Aboriginal people got here, despite the sea crossing, before Cro-Magnons and people got into Europe. So this was, in that out of Africa moment, this was, you know, one of the oldest and the first groups of people. Thomas?
Well, I find that having been raised with two propositions, that is that we are heinously young and callow, that's what we believed when I was a kid, and culturally inferior to everyone else, and on top of that, where our country has a dead heart. I find it an absolute relief, a spiritual relief, to find out that the heart isn't dead, that the map existed before the European map, and that there is a tension And I hope it's on the way, I hope, to becoming a creative tension between the world's youngest, one of the world's youngest immigrant societies, and the world's oldest civilization. Recently, just a few weeks ago, I was out again at a place called Lake Mungo, which has amongst its remains Mungo man and Mungo woman. Mungo woman is the oldest burial creation at 30,000 years. She's a member of Homo sapiens. She had osteoporosis of the shoulder. She's the auntie of us all, and I find that wonderfully stimulating.
Kate, when you started to approach the business of telling these stories of the early settlers fictionally, what kind of material did you have to base that on? I mean, were you reading collections of letters? Were there sufficient early histories? How did you set about it?
Well, I came at it in a very personal way. In 2000, we had a thing called the Walk for Reconciliation across Sydney Harbour Bridge, which was to sort of acknowledge the wrong that had been done and to sort of issue an aspirational call for doing something different in the future. And as we got to the end of that walk, I realised that right below us in Sydney Cove was the point at which my convict ancestor would have been offloaded from the ship. And I thought, well, here I am, his great-great-great-granddaughter, marching with a heart full of desire to make things better. But actually, I don't know what he did. I don't know what his relationship was with the Aboriginal people. And so the book started, The Secret River, started as a very urgent personal need to find out what happened. And the great resource I had was the family stories that my mother had told me, which included the detail that Solomon Wiseman, who was my great-great-great-grandfather, had, after being freed as a convict, gone up the Hawkesbury River, which is about 50 miles out of Sydney, and in this great phrase which Mum always used, he took up land on the Hawkesbury. And in that moment, I thought, wait a minute, this was not taking up land. What a wonderful elision of the words. What a wonderful
euphemism. As if you're taking up croquet or taking up cards or
taking
something.
Up
Not
something
take up land. Yeah.
Or taking up something that's been dropped on the footpath. In fact, of course, Solomon Wiseman simply took that land. And all these three books have arisen out of the need for me to find out, to unpick, actually, that phrase. What does it actually mean?
Why is it that there's clearly a war going on all the way through the 19th century, and Thomas, in your book, you explain how better and better rifles and fast firing rifles and so on allow the slaughter to carry on at a faster rate. Exactly, to me, like what was going on in America with the indigenous people there and Custer's Last Stand and all the rest of it. But we know all about America. We read about this, we see films about it, and this sort of frontier war that was going on in Australia, for most people, certainly for most people in Europe, completely unknown. Why is that, do you think?
It's because Deborah's forebears were scary people, of course. And if you were a solitary settler, because they were fighting for their land, and you didn't know that if you were a European. You thought you were entitled to be there. But another myth with which my generation was raised, and which is still believed by many Australians, is that the Aboriginals faded away. They did not confront the white pastoralists in the manner that the American settlers were confronted.
Which is just not true, is it?
And it's simply one of the purposes of my history here is to prove that that is not so, that it was a fierce battle. But there has been in all the journals the use of terms like dispersal. We dispersed the natives. The majesty of our fast-loading rifles spoke out amongst the rocks where the natives were sheltering. That sort of stuff, which means we massacred them. But it's not said, and helps the myth that there was a fading.
And Kate, in your novels, again and again, you have deeply morally conflicted people who will use one kind of language, such as we've just been hearing, but at the same time feel sort of sick inside and are unsure about what's going on. I mean, there are some straightforward bestial characters as well, but you seem to find it very important to focus on central characters who can't quite take it, can't quite be involved in the extermination going on.
Yes, and I think this is because, as Tom says, I also grew up in that Australia in which our history had been so thoroughly airbrushed that none of that remained. So, in a way, my books are as much about today as about yesterday, and where those characters find themselves, knowing what they're doing, and yet at the same time allowing themselves not to know, is exactly the Australia that I grew up in which, for example, I had a teacher, I remember, who adopted a little Aboriginal girl. This teacher arrived at school one day with the baby in the back seat, and we all oohed and ahed, and we asked where she had come from. And I remember this teacher saying, well, she's a poor little orphan girl. Now, of course, I realise, in hindsight, how that was almost certainly untrue. I was almost certainly witnessing one tiny individual of the stolen generations. So in a way, what I wanted, and yet I sort of knew that, and yet I didn't want to see it. And I think our generation was, that was our legacy from the past.
And this is what your books return to again and again, this notion of being determined to kind of use a rubber or an eraser across what had happened very recently in Australia, so that it does appear to be an empty, inviting continent which you can simply go in and start again afresh with.
Well, otherwise the moral situation is untenable. Otherwise you are simply walking into somebody else's country and taking it over by force. And that's untenable, without even the kind of, the sort of facade of the treaties which the American Indians had, and the Maori had. We didn't even bother with those kind of window dressings. So without that kind of, I mean, how could you live with yourself, actually, if you really saw what you were doing?
What is this process of true history, going back and looking much more clearly and intently at what actually happened? What is this going to do to Australia? I mean, you know, you walk around, it's impossible to avoid the indigenous people's greetings at ceremonies. There's all of that out there. There's the outward form going on. But what does it do to the way Australia thinks of itself?
I think it will strengthen Australia. I think that we have a shared history now. Certainly, my ancestors and the Aboriginal people of this land is the longest continuing culture in the world. Now, that's a great asset, but that's not the story that's told, well, not often enough. The images that you receive of Aboriginal people still are the ones of struggle and failure, fractured society, and yet there are many, many instances of success and achievement and much to be admired. And so I'm looking at the rest of my life as being a journey together in reconciliation. There have been many little points along the way that we've that march across the bridge, and I was there too, Kate, and I'm sure that you'll remember where you were.
On the bridge, yeah.
We were on the bridge together, even though we didn't know one another. There's a real potential here. If you take it back to that point before, you were saying, what does it mean to have this knowledge now that this is the longest continuing culture? I think if Australians can shed that sort of Burke and Wills view of Australia, in that they only see the dead heart and the disappearance and the fractured Aboriginal, and you know, if Burke and Wills had only seen what Aboriginal people could see, and that was that it was an abundant season of much food and water, and they wouldn't have perished in the desert as they did.
We should explain that these are the two famous explorers
Yes,
who went out improperly equipped, and almost all the early confrontations are about waterholes, aren't they, between
Yes.
Aboriginals and settlers?
Indeed, there is a bloody history, and I guess there's a tradition of the winners writing history, and yet both of my co-panellists are overturning that in the care and meticulous care that they take in their writing. Aboriginal people have maintained their culture, their history, and will in time feel more comfortable sharing that. And I think that there's a shared history to go forward with, as we all share part of the longest continuing culture.
And your last book was about reconciliation, Kate, wasn't it, really?
Well, all three books really are about reconciliation. The three books in this trilogy are really my way of saying I'm sorry. It's my personal way of sorry. It's interesting that you mentioned winners. I think you're right. Our history has always been written by the winners, but now the winners realise that we have won a Pyrrhic victory, because actually there's a sense in which unless we come to terms with the Aboriginal past of Australia and somehow find our way in it, we will never belong here. We will never feel right here. So yes, we are the victors, but I think we're just realising what a hollow victory that was.
Is some of this a little too easy, though? Because I was in Perth recently, and I noticed that everyone talks about what a multicultural society it is, and there's lots of Korean restaurants and Vietnamese, and there's Chinese people in the streets, and we are a buzzy, modern, multicultural society. And nobody talks really about all of those decades when it was white Australia, against the world. Don't let any Asians in at any cost. Mm-hmm. And it was incredibly recently, and yet everyone seems to sort of, that was then. We're all cool and trendy and reconciled now.
It's quite amazing what we serve up to the British when they come, particularly the royals, of what we still think we are. Kangaroo stew for Her Majesty, a spoken national anthem. It's quite incredible. I cringed over the last week that you've been in Perth.
Of course, one of our reasons, not our only reason for participating in World War I, was to secure white Australia. I don't want to degrade the undeniable bravery and immolation of those young men, but part of the thinking was if we help the Brits out, they'll help us and tolerate us remaining a white enclave. And that was a dream which ended only with the fall of Singapore in 1942.
And there is a very, very powerfully racist strain going through, as it were, socialist or Labour Party politics all the way through this thing. Which is why it's very interesting that it's somebody who comes out of the Labour Party, Kevin Rudd, who stands up and makes the great apology a couple of years ago.
Yes, the early Labour Party was very anti-Asian immigration because they thought Asian immigrants would be used to undermine industrial conditions. As they had said, we don't hate Asians, we just don't want them here.
I think we should come on to the specific work, which is Deborah Cheatham's opera. And I want to talk a little bit about your personal history and how that fed in, because it's directly relating to what we're talking about now. But just before we do, let's hear a little bit of that so that we know what we're talking about. This is from the first Indigenous opera to be performed in Australia. That was a little bit of Pecan Summer. Deborah, tell us what was happening there and then explain the structure of the opera.
That's actually the finale to Act 1, and it's the pivotal moment in the story when the people, the Yorta Yorta people, my ancestors in fact, who had been living on Kamargunja Mission for roughly 70 years, or thereabouts, they take their destiny into their own hands, and they do that at a time when the world is on the brink of uncertainty of its future. It was February 1939, and in southeastern Australia we were suffering the worst drought in history. Of course, the world was in the grip of the Great Depression, and we were all on the brink of the Second World War. And the people of Kamargunja Mission had had 70 years or more of dispossession.
What was the mission like? What describe life there?
The prehistory of Kamargunja was Maloga Mission. Maloga Mission was deemed to be too successful. The Aboriginal children were becoming too educated and they were thriving, so they shut that down and they set up a new mission called Kamargunja, just on the border between Victoria and New South Wales. And of course that border is the River Murray. And the Yorta Yorta people called the Murray the Dangala. So living on the banks of the Dangala, that mission again was quite successful. The Yorta Yorta men and women thrived there. They built a school, they had church. The Aboriginal Protection Board sent in someone who'd been moved on from another mission because of his poor reputation. And once this manager took over, conditions deteriorated and
there was a revolt, in effect.
And there was a revolt. The first mass strike by Aboriginal people in Australia. And 200 men, women and their children walked off Cummeragunja in the heat of that summer, 1939.
And the opera sort of circles around the issue of children being taken from their parents.
Indeed.
So that takes to your own story. Just explain to people what happened to you.
Well, when I was growing up, I had been led to believe that I'd been abandoned as a child. Perhaps going back to Kate's story of her teacher who arrived with a little Aboriginal girl in the back seat of the car. My adopted parents believed what they'd been told, in fact by an officer of the Salvation Army, that I'd been abandoned by my Aboriginal mother in a cardboard box in a field, which of course is roughly equated to Moses in the bulrushes, so not even an original story, but a story nonetheless that I accepted. But when I was 30, I received a letter from my Aboriginal mother. She'd managed to track me down, and she wrote a letter to me explaining that, in fact, at 3 weeks of age, I'd been taken from her. And as a single parent, my biological father had divorced her, had left her, and as a single parent in 1964, as an Aboriginal woman, my mother had no rights in this country. In fact, it wasn't until 1967 that Aboriginal people were no longer considered flora and fauna here.
And this taking of children was common at the time?
It was law. It was common practice, institutionalised by both church and state. I guess to an extent the church was the puppet of the state. But it was believed that Aboriginal children, especially if it was of mixed marriage, as my mother was full-blood Aboriginal, my father was Irish, and it was believed that these children could be re-educated and could form, a different kind of society.
And you emerged as a hugely successful opera singer. But by that stage, you've also come out as gay. It must have been a difficult first meeting with your mother from a very different background.
Well, it's interesting, the success in opera is sort of an ongoing sort of lifelong journey. Had I stayed with my Aboriginal family, they were all musicians. In fact, one is considered to be a national living treasure. His name's Jimmy Little, and he'd be very well known to my co-panellists.
Even performed with the Wiggles. That's how famous he is.
That's how famous he is. Royal Command performances and galore. But Uncle Jimmy was my mother's eldest brother. So I've no doubt that I would have had a career in music, and probably a lot sooner if I'd followed the path of the rest of my family down the country in Western Lane, as it were. A much longer road, of course, in the world of opera.
And you've written an opera, and again, you hear a lot of question marks going up in people's heads. Aboriginal culture, opera, isn't that such a big leap?
I think we invented opera. Right. I think that corroboree or ceremony for Aboriginal people is all about singing your story, dancing your story, acting your story, costumes, makeup. It much, much longer than any ring cycle. So I think that with apologies to the Italian listener or listeners, I do think that there's a strong connection between the sung story and Aboriginal people. So I didn't see it as a leap. Perhaps the many, many layers of vocal technique, yes. But then again, I'd argue that Aboriginal people have been singing acoustically for 60,000 years. So we're kind of designed, these broad faces are really designed to make a big sound, and that's what you need.
Did it make a difference, the Kevin Rudd apology to the Aboriginal people of Australia when that was made, or was that just another politician saying sorry for something that he himself wasn't personally responsible for? We've had a bit of experience of that in Britain.
Look, it made a great difference to me, and I guess I can only answer that on a personal level. As a member of the stolen generation, many times in my life I've had to explain to people that there was a stolen generation. and in fact justify that position. And
I think this is a story that people in Britain don't know at all.
I don't know if they do, but it's really one worth knowing, because then you can understand yourself on such a deep level, really, if you understand the history of Australia that's been revealed through this conversation and in many other forums. But I think that we as a people have this great need to connect as Australians together, rather than the us and them mentality. And I think that apology was a day when that actually did bring us together.
Kate, I think you were there, weren't you?
Absolutely. I was on the lawn outside Parliament House, and I stood there surrounded by a crowd of very largely Aboriginal people, most of whom were in tears, and the rest of us were very quickly too. And I thought, for the first time in my life, I was, how old, 55 or something, I am actually not ashamed to be Australian. That guillotine of the unspoken history had sort of been, my analogy is falling apart here, a kind of veil had always been between me and my sense of being able to feel that I belonged here. But that notion that the apology, no matter how symbolic, had been done, and that, yes, this notion of having a shared history rather than us versus them, it was like the beginning of a whole new possibility.
And it was virtually the first act of that parliament for that year. It was really remarkable that day. It's to have the truth of your existence recognised and to not have to justify that. It was no small thing.
Although almost everything about it is different in terms of the people, the drama, the numbers, and the way it was played out, there are parallels with South Africa, Thomas. I feel that there's an underlying long sort of wound and process of healing.
Yes, that's there's no
less
doubt
dramatic,
about that.
perhaps, but nonetheless.
And the process is still continuing. One of the problems, dare I say this, Deborah, is that it is so hard for a sedentary livestock grazing, wheat growing, etc., society that wants to set down towns and so on. It's so hard for it to understand the value and the spiritual value, the immense spiritual story behind the nomadic life. And so we're still coming to terms with the damage that the dispossession did these people. And I say that one of the things that I felt at the apology was, would I, as a backside out of the trousers Scot or Englishman or Irishman who believed in the sanctity of livestock and my right to the earth, if I had found my stock speared, if I had found my shepherd killed and his hut burned, no matter how much he might have been violating local Aboriginal women, how would I have reacted? I don't know how I would have reacted. So even as Rudd apologised, I was still I still had to recognise that one of the reasons I write about race so much from Schindler's List to this is because I don't know how I would have behaved in those circumstances. I hope I would have behaved well.
But the characters that you introduce again and again from the 1870s and the 1880s and the 1890s, had they been told about something like the Rudd apology to the Aboriginal people, would have found it completely incomprehensible. They wouldn't even have known where it was starting from, I suspect.
Well, some of them, but perhaps not all, because when you read in the 19th century, you realise that this debate has been going on for a very long time. One of the very early governors, I think it was Burke, maybe it was Gibbs, anyway, one of the very early 19th century governors said, words to the effect that I have always considered the Aboriginal people the true owners of the soil. There was, you would have read it too, the debates in the Sydney Gazette, is the fact that the Aboriginal people didn't plough and graze proof that they don't belong, or in fact, are they using the land just as we are?
Yes, well, it's proof that, farming and grazing and irrigation actually doesn't work in Australia, and you have to work pretty hard against the elements to sustain it. So again, the Burke and Wills mentality that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
And yet this level of understanding, if I think about one of my ancestors, William Cooper. William Cooper was a Yorta man. He's recently been honoured in a garden in Israel because William Cooper, Aboriginal Yorta man from Kamragunja, who had moved to Melbourne in the early 1900s to gain purchase, if you like, for his people back up on country. William Cooper was the only person to write a complaint after Kristallnacht to the German consulate.
Really?
And that letter that William Cooper wrote, Aboriginal Yorta man, in 1938 is enshrined in the Jewish History Museum in Melbourne. In all of Australia, there was one man, and he was Aboriginal, who had this empathy and this understanding for a race that was about to be on the edge of annihilation and driven from the whole of Europe. So I think that there must have been, I hold hope that there must have been the Scot with the shepherd who had been speared that would say, well, why, how did we come to this?
And many behaved well, and many Aboriginals went to settle on the, in inverted commas, good pastoralist land because they knew they'd be safe there.
Yes, there are a lot of stories. Mary Gilmore's father was a manager who was ordered to go out and massacre Aboriginal people and refused.
You see, you're coming back to the end of this discussion. I'm beginning to think the best history is family history. It's amazing how often people have been citing their own families and their own people, and often it undercuts what the sort of the received pap of so much history. Not, of course, Thomas Keneally's fine work. Thank you to all my guests. That fine work, Eureka to the Diggers, is the second volume of his epic history of the Australians. It's just out in Australia. It will be out in Britain in May. Kate Grenville's new novel, Sarah Thornhill, will also be out early next year, Kate, I think. And details of Deborah Cheatham's opera Pecan Summer and all her other projects are on the Start the Week website. Next week, history closer to home with vanished kingdoms and London pioneers. Norman Davies, Alison Weir, Boris Johnson and Peter England. But for now, thank you and goodbye. If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try some others, such as The Forum, the discussion programme about global ideas. And to find out more, visit bbcworldservice.com/forum.
Basis that if Magwitch in Great Expectations, the convict revenant to England, could succeed here, then both his sons could. And they ran up against the reality of rainfall and its infrequency and the agony it produces for any European who first drives out the Aboriginals and then brings what you could call the dreaming of sheep and cattle to these marginal areas.
And quite bizarrely, they also rub up against Trollope's son, who's there as well.
Yes. Well, you see, that's the thing about transportation. It didn't end with convicts. Britain has always used Australia as a dumping ground for the socially unedifying. Recently, your Prime Minister before last, Mr Brown, apologised to all the poor children that were sent here as a part of various improving schemes. Many of them, a friend of mine, were told that they were orphans and they were not, and they were put in terrible homes, and therefore transportation continued, if you like, till the 20th century.
Meanwhile, the image of Australia all the way through as this incredibly healthy country where none of the slum conditions that workers in Europe experienced took place, where there were these clean-limbed, healthy, bronzed, sort of happy workers. And as you're Jimmy Blacksmith, but who has since turned historian, recently producing a multi-volume history of Australia. And the latest one takes us up from the 1860s and the end of the transportation of convicts right up to just after the First World War. This is, I guess, the period when Australia is really becoming a nation, moving from being individual colonies coming together in a new way.
Yes, population is increasing. The convicts are still with us, including some relatives of mine. These colonies, which after all are round about as widespread as London to Moscow, are considering struggling to confederate over such a huge distance without email and...
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, today we're talking about the history and, well, almost the spiritual condition of Australia, that vast land we still tend to squeeze into a few garish caricatures. I'm joined by the award-winning novelist Kate Grenville, who's fictionalised some of the early stories of white settlers and Aboriginal people moving from curiosity and wonder to cruelty and greed. By the opera singer Deborah Cheetham, herself Aboriginal, but who also describes herself as a closet white Baptist lesbian ABBA fan, and has written Australia's first Indigenous opera, of which more later. But we're going to start today with the writer Thomas Keneally, perhaps best known for novels such as Schindler's List and The Chant of...
Without telephone. It's astounding that they managed to do so. And the question arose, is Australia the working man's paradise? And is the Australian land the ennobler of the immigrant from Europe?
And certainly at the beginning of this period, in what we might think of in Britain as mid-Victorian times, it's still unclear really what's in the middle of Australia as far as the white settlers are concerned. There are no rivers, but this becomes only slowly apparent. As you say, there's no Mississippi in this country, and it's going to be an arid and tough place to settle.
And that's contrary to what British novelists like Trollope and Dickens believed about Australia. Dickens sent two of his boys here, his sons, on the